Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, assistant sports editor for multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined for our weekly Penn State football chat by Joel Haas of the Post-Gazette and the Daily Collegian following a big loss to Ohio State over the weekend. Penn State loses 20-13 at Beaver Stadium. And now they have another big game this week. They'll face Washington at the official whiteout game, 8 p.m. on Peacock. So we've got a lot to look back on. We got a lot to look forward to. I'm excited to break it all down. Before we do, just want to thank our sponsor for this episode of the podcast, the Voodoo Brewing Company, State College. Enjoy world-renowned craft beer, delicious cocktails, and our almost famous lobster rolls at Voodoo Brewing Company, State College Pub, located right off College Avenue and Route 322 at 201 Elmwood Street, State College. VBC has something exciting going on every day of the week. Join us this fall on Mondays for weekly free play cornhole tournaments or test your knowledge with pub trivia every Tuesday at 6. Wednesday is our game night featuring board games, card games, and adult games. Every Thursday, your boy Dots hosts bingo, but this is not your Nana's bingo. Saturday, we have your Nittany Lions and college football on all day. Finish things off on Sunday with their weekly brunch paired with Steelers, Eagles, and Red Zone coverage. Can't wait to see you at the VBC State College Pub. All right, Joel, well, let's get into it. I think there's been a lot of podcasting on big picture, state of the program, state of James Franklin's tenure. A lot of conversation about that this week. I don't really have a lot of interest in delving into that right now. I think there's going to be plenty of time in the off season to take stock of where things stand with this program. Right now, they still only have one loss, and they're in the thick of this college football playoff race. They're still number six in the rankings. I think most of college football would probably take that in a heartbeat. So I want to talk about what they have left over this last month, maybe 2 months, depending upon how long a potential playoff run would go. And I think it's impossible to have that conversation without looking at these receivers. How are you looking at those guys right now after 3 catches on Saturday against Ohio State? Do you think that they are going to credibly threaten anyone in December, possibly January? Do they have time to develop into that over this last month? Or do you look at, I look at the way they played in that first half of the Peach Bowl last season, where the receivers basically didn't have any catches, ended up piling up some garbage time stats later on. But when that game was still in the balance, the receivers were basically as invisible in that game as they were Saturday against Ohio State. So what is your outlook for this group and how it affects the entire team's chances for the rest of 2024?
Yeah, I think it's never a good sign when your leading receiver is your running back, and when Nick Singleton has more catches than all of the wide receivers combined. And obviously we know what Tyler Warren's been able to do there, kind of helping out from tight end, and it seemed like a lot of the focus was on him. It looked like he was getting double teamed for a lot of the game. But to your point, yeah, the receivers were bad. There's no other way to put it. I thought they've been bad for, I think Wisconsin also was pretty rough, which is, unfortunate coming off the USC game because, Drew Allar had almost 400 yards in that game. Obviously a lot of it to Tyler Warren, but also some to the receivers. I thought they, maybe looked a little bit better. And then there were other games throughout the year, whether it was Liam Clifford having 100 yards, Harrison Wallace in the season opener going over 100 yards, just different guys throughout the season having kind of big games, showing up, for a game here and there, a quarter here and there, but just, not consistently. And obviously that's been a talking point, even going back to last year as well, with the struggles that they've had as a room. And I think it's just kind of more of the same at this point. And, you're 8 games into the season. I don't think much is going to change between now and the end of the year, or even into postseason play, just in terms of, their production and what they're capable of. If you're going to make improvements, the off season is kind of the time to do that. And then once you're in the season, it's just about, focusing on actually playing the games, and you're not really worried about kind of, refining your technique and things like that. So I think at this point of the season, they just are what they are. Depending on what you can get from Drew, potentially he's able to elevate the receivers if, he plays a great game. But outside of that, I don't see them doing much. And especially once you get into the playoffs, that's obviously going to be a topic of conversation. I think it's still a glaring weakness on the team. And again, earlier in the season, we kind of saw flashes where we thought, maybe things are fixed. Maybe Kotelnicki is kind of the guy to come in and scheme them open and get them more opportunities and things like that. But I think it's just been pretty puzzling these last couple of years to see the lack of success. And I'm not sure, or I don't think they'll be able to turn it around, at the end of the season.
Joel, I do want to talk about Drew Allar's role in this passing game in a minute, but I think you led into my second question well, which is that Andy Kotelnicki's come in here. He's been celebrated for his creativity. His clips get shared. They go viral, especially that touchdown at USC that Tyler Warren caught after snapping the ball. There are probably plenty of teams in college football that would like to have his number going into this offseason. And I think Penn State fans have a tendency to go straight to blaming the coaching, the coordinator for the play calling, and if only it was more imaginative and blah, blah, blah. That's usually the complaint. And I don't think you can level that complaint on Andy Kotelnicki. I think you can look at really the last 2 years. You go back to the Michigan game last year that they lost at Beaver Stadium. I looked it up before the show. The receivers had 5 total catches in that game, so they were basically invisible. They did a little bit better against Ohio State at Ohio State last year, but again, there were some garbage time stats that were mixed in there, and it wasn't like they were consistently threatening the Buckeyes downfield until the Buckeyes were kind of in prevent defenses and things of the such. So this is now if you include the Peach Bowl, those 2 losses in the regular season last season, and this season's loss to Ohio State. That's 4 games that look very similar across 3 different offensive coordinators or offensive coordinator duos like they had with the interims at the end of last season. Can you blame this on anything other than the talent in the room? Because I look at that and I say, James Franklin's not consistently rolling up snake eyes and hiring guys that are capable of calling capable of creative play calling. He keeps giving these coaches the same players, and the same players keep letting them down.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it does have to do with recruiting at the end of the day. There's only so much improvement that a receiver can make once they step on campus. And, a lot of the times recruiting rankings, tend to be pretty accurate in terms of, who the better players are coming out of high school. And Penn State has missed on a lot of key guys, especially in recent cycles. Obviously, when you look at that, that's partially on Franklin. I look at Marcus Hagans, who, now in his second year as wide receivers coach. It's been a pretty rough start for him. And I think he's probably, looking at the hot seat here if things don't get turned around, either at the end of this year or heading into next season. And, we know Franklin's pretty quick to kind of, flip through coordinators when things aren't working out well. And so I think, you just look at that recruiting and it's been pretty poor. And I think, there's only a certain amount of coaching that you can do once you get those guys to campus if they're not, physically ready, or sometimes it just comes down to the player, if their mentality, if they're not coachable, if they're not willing to work hard enough to improve, things like that. There's only so much you can do. But I think you have to blame the coaches in this situation, because whether or not they're coaching the wide receivers well enough, whether or not they're scheming them open well enough, or whether or not they're recruiting well enough. Like, if you want to complain about the players they have, it's the coach's job to recruit those players. So they can only look at themselves and think that maybe they should be recruiting better, or even this offseason probably should have gone into the portal and hit the portal a little bit harder in terms of receivers. Obviously, they brought in Julian Fleming, who so far has not lived up to expectations, has not even come close to them either. And I think they probably could have brought in a few more guys to the portal, or again, just the last few cycles they could have done a better job with recruiting. So I think it ultimately falls back on the coaches there.
I will agree with that partially, Joel, but the more we get into this NIL house settlement era, I think it bears repeating that there is a money problem at Penn State, and that is on a lot of these national podcasts. That's what they're talking about: is why would Penn State fans expect to be better? Where do they get the impression that they belong as a top 5 program with the resources that their donor class is expending? And I think receiver is a perfect place to crystallize that situation, because they're just not good enough, and they have lost out. And yes, that is partially on the coaching staff. But if you can't entice some of these 5-star talents, or even prospects that you feel good about, that you can develop into being really good players, like Chris Godwin was not the number 1 recruit prospect in the country. He was fairly well regarded, but he was a guy that Penn State developed into kind of a consummate pro, a great NFL player, and a productive college player. And I think you go down the line with Jahan Dotson. He's a guy that I think probably fits that mold of, a good prospect, but not someone you expected to be the monster that he was in those last couple of years. KJ Hamler, I think, is probably the closest you can get to entered with a lot of hype and lived up to it. But for the most part, Penn State's success stories at receiver have been, good, not great players. And I just wonder to what degree, they're just not paying the going rate for those types of players because of where Penn State is in NIL. And that, I think a very frustrating thing about this era is that it's just hard to know, right? It's all happening behind the scenes. It's not like the NFL where you get, contracts announced, terms, length, all that kind of stuff. And you can kind of assess a team like you do with the Steelers or the Eagles or any other team that Penn State fans root for. So much of that's public information. And right now, if you're a Penn State fan, you're just kind of looking at the group and saying, this isn't nearly good enough, and drawing that line to, is there enough donor support? So, I think that's going to remain a big topic going into the offseason because I think the only way you can get better quickly there, Joel, is if you write some big checks in the portal. Otherwise, you're relying on, freshmen coming in and making big impacts and going Derek Williams, Deion Butler, Jordan Norwood style, going crazy. And that's kind of like a comet across the sky, Joel. I did want to get into Drew Allar. You mentioned him. What do you think his role is in the way these receivers are playing? Do you think he is letting them down in any way? Or do you look at the production of a Nick Singleton? Do you look at the production of a Tyler Warren, some of these other tight ends at times, and say, listen, he finds them when they're open, and they're open a lot more often than these receivers are.
Yeah, I tend not to put any of the blame on Drew just because I feel like he does a good job, and kind of it's been the same story that you've heard, since he's been a starter, where the receivers have kind of struggled to create separation. And again, you could argue that he should be throwing more of those, 50-50 balls. James Franklin obviously would get mad if you suggested that, but you could certainly make the argument that he should be giving his receivers more chances. But you look even at this Ohio State game, he threw up kind of a 50-50 ball to Trey Harris in the end zone. It ends up getting intercepted. And so, if you're Drew, it's like there's not much more you can do. If your wide receivers aren't going to go up and make plays, you have to wait for them to get open. And if they're not getting open, you might have to dump it down to Singleton on a little wheel route or something like that. Or obviously Tyler Warren is a guy who's kind of built up that level of trust that Allar feels more comfortable with throwing to him. And, if you're in a, third and long or even a fourth down situation where you need someone reliable, if you're Drew, I don't think you can blame him for, going to, a tight end or a running back instead of the receivers, just because they haven't really proven themselves to be capable. But I think for the most part, when Drew does throw the ball to them, which, you could argue he should be doing more often, but I think when he does throw the ball, it's usually always catchable. We don't see him, missing guys. We don't see him just, throwing the ball out of bounds, things like that. It's almost always a catchable ball that's, either, a drop, a catch, or, it's maybe broken up or something like that. But for the most part, it's within the vicinity of the receiver. And at that point, I think it's mostly on them to kind of make a play. But I think also, if they want the ball more, it's, you got to get open before Drew's going to throw that ball. We've seen him be conservative. He's aired it out a little bit more this season. But again, he's going to give the ball to his best playmakers, and he's going to give the ball to the guys who are getting open. And if that's not the receivers, then, he's just not going to throw to them.
Yeah, or he's gonna take the ball himself, Joel. I think we're seeing that more and more. The timely runs on Saturday, and it's it started out as like he'd do a couple of those a game, and now it's like a core piece of his game. And I think there's been a lot of comparisons between him and Josh Allen, and I think for his pro stock, it's probably good for him to show that he can do those things. But I think it's a bad sign for Penn State's offense that he's doing that as often and as confidently as he is. He's not doing it out of desperation. He just feels like he goes through the progression, sees nothing, says, these guys are not going to get open if I hold it for another second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. So I'm just going to go and take the 5 yards. And it's smart. And again, I think this is one of those we're in one of those hobby horse situations where Penn State fans love to go at, the quarterback if he's not winning big games. But I don't see that. I completely agree with you, Joel. I see a guy who's doing the best with what he's got, and what he's got is just not a lot of talent. And I don't think Penn State fans are used to that and tend to blame the quarterback when I think they assume that the talent level is higher than it is. And there's been screenshots all over the internet. These guys were just not open Saturday. That's something Penn State is going to have to reckon with. Joel, I alluded to this a little bit, but does this feel like a long-term problem for Penn State unless someone starts cutting a ton of checks to get big name receivers in here? Because I look at it, I think it's a pretty bleak situation past the end of this season. Just because they're not demonstrating the ability to develop these guys, it's been 2 years, and I don't really see an end in sight, short of changing the room, pretty entirely through the transfer portal.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with you. I mean, all the guys who are currently in the room, I don't think any of them are heading off to the NFL or anything like that. But it'll be interesting to see if they just want to graduate or if they want to come back for potentially a fifth year or something like that. But a lot of the older guys in the room, just haven't produced, and I don't think they're heading off to the NFL. It'd be interesting to see. Because again, if they do come back, potentially, and then you add some more pieces, you could maybe see an improved room next year. So I would be curious to see kind of what these guys decide to do. But you look at some of the younger guys on the team. I think of like Caden Saunders, who, was a high 4-star. He was one of the top 100 recruits in the country in that class a couple of cycles ago. Obviously, he's been dealing with injuries this season that have kind of pushed him back. But even when he's healthy, I don't think he's been, overly impressive. Has, barely been really used at all. And so I think that was kind of disappointing for Penn State. Obviously, they had him back there at punt return for a little bit, but I think he even stopped doing that. So, he's kind of fizzled out in terms of, the hype he had coming into the program, in a really talented recruiting class, because he was the same class as Drew and some of those other guys. And then he redshirted because he was, I think, a little bit too small physically was how the coaches put it. And they wanted him to kind of bulk up for that first season. But, he's a guy that's kind of fizzled out since arriving on campus. I mean, Omari Evans is a younger guy who's shown flashes, but hasn't been able to really consistently put it together on the field. And so even some of those younger pieces, even the true freshmen who are coming in, I mean, we've heard good stuff from Tyser Denmark. Obviously we haven't really seen much from him. We've heard good stuff, but obviously, that's what you're going to hear from the coaches. You're never going to say anything bad. And a guy like Peter Gonzalez, who, another 4-star who's coming in as a true freshman this year, who hasn't really done much. He's been injured, with, I think, bumps and bruises, according to Franklin. But even looking at some of the underclassmen, some of the younger guys, we haven't really seen any, substantial game action from them, which, maybe they're great and we just, haven't been able to see it yet. But I tend to believe that, if they haven't been able to find the field yet, that's, not a great sign. You would hope that, some of those younger guys could potentially step into a weaker receiving room right now and maybe pick up a bit of a bigger workload, but we haven't really seen that either. And so, if you're looking at kind of the stat sheet right now, it's some of the older guys at the top, and it's not like those guys have been necessarily very good. And then underneath that, it's not like any of the younger guys are really surprising you with big contributions or anything like that. And even projecting forward to the recruiting classes that haven't arrived on campus yet, I don't think Penn State has any, big name 4 or 5-star guys who are coming in. And so I think it is in a pretty bad situation right now. I find it a little bit difficult to understand why Penn State struggled so much to recruit at that position, because obviously we know Penn State is a pretty good recruiting program. Franklin's always been known as a good recruiter. And you look at kind of the recent history of wide receivers, it kind of cuts off a couple years ago, but you look at a lot of guys that they've sent to the NFL who have produced at Penn State. And it's interesting because you'd think they'd be able to use that as kind of a marketing tactic to get some of these guys in. But at the end of the day, if your NIL isn't in the same spot as other schools, money talks, and recruits want to go to the places that are going to pay them more, even if they're not necessarily going to win as many games at a different school. So.
Yeah, I think all of that is correct, Joel. And just to be clear, I mean, I don't want to sound like too negative about Penn State's outlook here. I still think they can beat most of the teams in the Big Ten with the guys that they've got. This is a question of are you good enough to beat Ohio State? And that's the bar for Penn State in any given season. There's more of those programs in the Big Ten now. You have Oregon now. Michigan is probably going to come back here after this down season. You're going to have more teams that you're going to have to beat, and then you're going to have to go to college football playoffs. And to make any kind of noise, for us not to get sick of talking about first round exits, which is, there's really not a huge difference between making a 12-team playoff and making a New Year's Six Bowl and losing to Ole Miss. And I think, this year Penn State will benefit from the excitement of being in the field. But if they flame out in the first round, if they play Notre Dame, who they're currently projected to play, you flame out in the first round against Notre Dame, people are going to get annoyed quickly, and you're going to face more good teams at the end of your schedule to have to go anywhere. And these games are going to matter more than like a bowl game. You're not going to be able to write off losing to Notre Dame in a first round game at Beaver Stadium the same way you can write off losing to Ole Miss in the Peach Bowl, because half the roster opted out and everything was changing in college football. These are going to be problems, and that's the bar that you're grading Penn State on right now. So, I think Penn State's still going to be a good program. I think they're still going to be a top 12 program. They're going to make the playoff most of these years. But to get where people want them to go, this isn't good enough. And that's kind of the bar that I'm grading them by at the moment. Wanted to get into the play calling a little bit, Joel. I know everyone's upset, asking the question, why didn't Tyler Warren see the ball in the last possession? I can't get over them putting the guard in motion. I think on three straight runs leading up to that throw to Trey Wallace in the end zone. Is that evidence of a bigger problem of potentially Andy Kotelnicki getting a little high on his own supply and, on his own press and trying to do this crazy stuff that it looks great when you land the block against UCLA in the second quarter, like he did earlier in the season. It makes a great viral clip, but when the game is on the line, to call plays that way, if it works, then we're not having this conversation, but it didn't 3 straight times. And it seemed a little arrogant to me, Joel.
Yeah. I mean, it was definitely an interesting, set of plays, and James Franklin has gotten asked about it a few different times now and has kind of given more explanation to it. I thought he was actually pretty candid with us on Monday, just kind of walking through that. He said typically he doesn't like to kind of interrupt the play calling throughout the game. He likes to kind of let Kotelnicki, do his thing, call the plays. He says he never talks, as the play is being delivered or during the play, because he wants to kind of have the clear line of communication. He doesn't have too many voices, causing distraction and things like that. And every once in a while he'll give some advice to Kotelnicki, like, maybe let's try and run more, or let's try and use this player more, or something like that. But he doesn't necessarily get too involved. So I think it, kind of falls on Kotelnicki there. And Franklin said in hindsight, you want to get your best players the ball. You probably want to get Tyler Warren the ball, because you look, the play that set them up was a 33-yard run by Tyler Warren, and then he gets them to whatever the 3-yard line, and they get 0, 1, 1, and 0 yards on consecutive plays. They did say that fourth down play, we got to talk to Drew after the game. He said his initial read for that fourth down play was supposed to go to Tyler Warren. Warren wasn't open, so he went to Dinkins. I didn't think Dinkins was open either. That was double, maybe triple coverage there. So just a kind of bad broken down play there at the end on that fourth down. But even the 3 plays before that, like you mentioned, sending linemen in motion, kind of a creative wrinkle, a thing they've done before. I think Ohio State was prepared for it. I don't think, they were caught by surprise. And then other than that, it was just an inside run from Katron Allen, who was getting stuffed. I think, if it doesn't work the first 2 times, I feel like you got to go away from it and, again, try and get Tyler Warren the ball, even if it's just, a handoff to him or a wildcat snap or something like that. But again, hindsight 2020. And if they go down there and hand it to Katron on first down and he scores, completely different story. We probably go to overtime potentially, and maybe even Penn State wins the game. But everyone's going to go back and criticize after a close game. Everyone's going to be kind of nitpicking, all the little things that you could have called differently, things like that. I think the problem for Franklin, at least from the optics of it, is that this seems to always happen where Penn State loses by 1 score, even 1 point a couple times, and there's always some type of decision that was questionable that happened to not go Penn State's way. And again, if it had gone Penn State's way, no one would be complaining. But there always seems to be some little thing like that goes against Penn State during these games against Ohio State for whatever reason. And I think fans like to point that out and kind of blame the coaching staff for that. But I think if you're the players, if you're not able to punch the ball in on 3 straight runs from the 3-yard line, like, I don't think you deserve that touchdown. So.
Yeah, I mean that they certainly didn't execute, and you should be able to get that yard, and they did not. Joel, let's get into this week's matchup. with Washington. What are you looking for in this game? Do you think it's a letdown spot, or because it's the official whiteout? Do you think that there's still going to be juice for this game? And because they are the defending, national runner-up, are they not? Is this not a letdown spot? Because sometimes we have seen that from Franklin teams. I think of the Michigan State game in 2017 specifically, where the air came out of the balloon a little bit, and then they go into the next game and kind of sleepwalk. What is your read on how they are approaching things this week?
Yeah, well, I think this is like the least amount of energy I've ever kind of sensed in the lead up to a whiteout game. I think the fan base at this point is kind of deflated. They had a record-setting crowd of 111,000 at the last game against Ohio State just to watch, a one-score loss, the 8th consecutive loss to Ohio State. And I think a lot of the fans at this point are kind of deflated from that. So I haven't sensed a whole lot of energy coming from the fans. I mean, it'll be a whiteout. I don't know, if it'll be one of the loudest whiteouts we've ever seen, but it should be a pretty great environment regardless. But I think the interesting thing about this, just in terms of the trap game potential or the letdown potential, I think the interesting thing is the way that the players are handling it. I think they've kind of moved on really quickly from the Ohio State game, where you look last year when Penn State lost to Ohio State, and then same thing when they lost to Michigan. It was Drew Allar's crying after the game, and other players are crying and things like that, and everyone's upset, and it's just a bad scene. And one of the things I will say is post-game media after these 3 losses. Last year when Penn State lost to Ohio State and Michigan, I think we got like 4 or 5 players at post-game media, which is not a lot. This year they brought out like 10, 11, something like that for post-game media after the loss to Ohio State. And I think part of that is that the players were in I guess a little bit of a better mood, to put it lightly, and things like that. I think they were just, they weren't taking the loss as harshly, and obviously they were still emotional. They wanted that game. Guys like Devon Ellies were kind of tearing up a little bit during post game, but I think the fact that they gave us more players and things like that tells us that the mood in the locker room was a little bit different. They felt like they were still a little bit more composed, and things like that after that game. And a lot of the guys, even I know Abdul Carter tweeted something like this, and some of the guys, I think Kobe King was one of them, talked about it after the game. But they want to face Ohio State again, and I think after last year's loss to Ohio State, it was just we got outplayed. You know what I mean? It was just pure disappointment last year. And then you look at this year, a lot of the guys were thinking, we were in that game. We could have won that game. It certainly felt more competitive than last year's game. And a lot of the guys talked about, the potential of meeting the Buckeyes again in the playoffs. If the bracket falls that way, they were excited about that opportunity. It sounded like they really wanted a rematch. And some of the players were even saying, if Ohio State wanted to line it up again at 7 p.m. that same day, they would run it back and they would play them again that same day, because they were, desperate to get another shot, and they know how close they were in that game. And so I think the mood around Penn State was a lot different this year. I think the team really recognized that, they were in it. They were competing against one of the best teams in the country, and they know that they can have another shot down the road. So I think the team responded pretty well to the loss. I would say the fan base probably didn't, but I would say the players themselves did. So.
Yeah, I want to get into that a little bit, Joel. You mentioned the vitriol after the game. It seemed to get to James Franklin. He kind of gets into it with a fan, which may have only egged on, further antagonism from the fan base. It's not the first time he's kind of made headlines for the wrong reason in the last month. Obviously, at that press scrum where he was asked about the criminal allegations against the 2 former players, he moved off to the side and generated a ton of criticism, and then had to apologize to reporters for not just kind of saying exactly what they said in the press release if they can't comment any further. Do you think the pressure is getting to this guy at all? Do you think the public narrative is affecting him in a way that should concern Penn State fans? Because I don't know that this is a James Franklin we've ever seen. I think he's been, incredibly savvy and always thought about the optics, and has mostly managed them well. And to the extent he hasn't, it's usually been, saying things like comparing Pitt to Akron and stuff like that. And it's been kind of galvanizing for Penn State fans, but not, embarrassing in any way. What's your read on where he is, at this point in his tenure?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of pressure on him. I think this game felt a little bit different than years past. I think there was a little bit more talk and a little bit higher expectations of Penn State potentially being able to win. It was one of the first times during Franklin's tenure where Penn State was the higher ranked team. They weren't necessarily favored by the spread, but it was a very narrow spread. And again, they had the number 3 ranking. Ohio State was number 4. We'd already seen Ohio State lose once this year. There's a lot of talk about Ohio State coming into this game banged up. It seemed like they were, pretty gettable. This was one of the better chances that Penn State had to win, and obviously they weren't able to do it. So I do think there's a lot of pressure on James Franklin right now. I don't know. I wouldn't say that that's necessarily a bad thing because, obviously pressure can, it can crack dams and cause floods, but pressure can also make diamonds. And so, looking at James Franklin right now, you kind of have to see, is he going to crumble under this pressure or is he going to kind of use it? And kind of force himself to elevate his game and take it to the next level and really harness that pressure and come up with something good down the stretch and kind of make up for it with a big performance, potentially in the playoffs and things like that. So yes, I do think there's pressure. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's good to have pressure. All of the top programs in the country have a lot of pressure. Their head coaches have the most pressure in the country, and the best teams, the best fan bases, keep their team under pressure. They always want to be better. They always know that they can elevate the team. And even when they're winning, and, Penn State right now is favored to finish the season 11-1, and the fans are still going to be on James Franklin. They're still going to be mad at him. They're still going to be, annoyed that he wasn't able to get over the hump against Ohio State. And I think that can be a good thing because it keeps that pressure on the team and it keeps the team, on its toes. They can't get complacent. They can't relax, things like that, because the fan base just isn't going to be satisfied with it, frankly, unless they get a national championship, I feel like. So I think that pressure can be a good thing, but we'll have to see what happens because, again, that pressure, if it gets to him and things start spiraling, it could get ugly. So it'll be interesting to see kind of which direction things go from here.
I think you led into the next question well, which is can this team afford to lose again? Because I think that's the big problem here, Joel, is that you look at the resume and these quality wins that they seemingly had on paper are just falling away. USC's benching Miller Moss. Wisconsin got its doors blown off on Saturday. Illinois lost again, and they're now out of the rankings. So even though Penn State has a top 25 win at the time, they no longer have any wins against teams currently ranked in the top 25. I think it's a big concern, Joel. I think 11-1 gets them in, but I think fans are reasonably looking and saying you should go 11-1 against this schedule, and that it's hard to give them a ton of credit, even as thrilling as that comeback was at USC. Just seeing that team is not, I don't think it's a bad team. I don't think it's a trash team, but I think it's certainly not the team we built it up to be in the lead up to that game, and it's not the team that we built it up to be in the immediate afterglow of that game. And I think if Penn State goes 11-1 and they win this game last week against Ohio State, but maybe they trip up against the Washington this week, or they trip up against a Maryland in the season finale, something like that, it is a different conversation because you've won a big game and you're in no real danger. Whereas I feel like they're in some real danger now, Joel, that there is nothing else in this resume. This was your one shot to kind of solidify things, and now you're going to be trying to avoid an upset for a month. You're going to be the hunted team for a month, and you have significant problems.
Yeah. I think, first of all, Penn State, I think they should go 11-1. I think they will go 11-1. They're favored to, and I think if you're Penn State, that's the message that you want to be pushing to your players, is that, you don't want to leave anything up to chance. You don't want to leave anything up to the committee because you never know what they're going to do. You don't want to give them the opportunity to boot you from the bracket. But, like you mentioned, a lot of Penn State's games felt big at the time and have turned out to not be. West Virginia week 1 was, hyped up as a potential trap game for Penn State, and West Virginia was receiving votes. And, you look at, like you mentioned with USC, they were the number 26 team. If you look at, others receiving votes at the time, and Illinois was obviously ranked at the time, and even going to Wisconsin in a tough environment, Wisconsin was on kind of a 3-game heater, and everyone was saying they were, one of the hottest teams in the country, and all these games that at the time felt like big games that, in hindsight don't look as big. I still think they were challenging games, and I still think they were good wins for Penn State to be able to do that. But the narrative from the outside looking in, if you're not following the team closely, and if you're not really, looking into all the details, and you're just saying, all these teams that Penn State beat are, losing all these games, obviously the narrative doesn't look great because, like you mentioned, Penn State hasn't beaten any team that's currently ranked in the top 25 and probably won't for the rest of the season. I don't see any of their future opponents being ranked. And so, yeah, it's going to be tough for Penn State to make that case. You would hope that the committee can kind of recognize that, even though Penn State hasn't played a top 25 team necessarily, hasn't beaten a top 25 team, they still have beaten a lot of top 30, top 40 teams, teams in that range, and they've done so convincingly in a lot of cases. And, you would hope that that's enough to get in with a potential slip up here. And obviously a lot of it depends on what other teams around the country are doing. And the kind of resumes that they're able to post. But I think if you're Penn State, you are kind of lacking that marquee win, and a second loss might be enough to knock you out. So I think you just have to move forward with the mentality of, you can't slip up because you don't want to leave anything to chance, because, it doesn't mean that they're definitely out with the second loss. And again, there's a lot of other factors that can go into it. It depends on which team they lose to, how much they lose by, how that team, finishes the season. If it looks, like they lost to a better team, and then obviously what other teams around the country are doing. But, at the end of the day, Penn State controls its own destiny still. And I think that's kind of the mentality that they have to take moving forward.
Yeah, I think all those factors are going to matter. Joel, I did want to quickly get to the first college football playoff rankings released Tuesday night. They have Penn State playing Notre Dame in the first round at Beaver Stadium. I don't know if I want to dig too much into matchups, because these things are going to change. There are more big games that will shape what the bracket actually looks like. I think I want to ask in kind of the more 30,000 foot level, do you see Penn State going into a game against a Notre Dame or a team of that caliber that's a good team but also has its flaws, and feel good about them, winning a game like that and maybe getting that validating win that can maybe get some of the heat off of James Franklin? Or did this team you saw play Ohio State on Saturday, do you look at them and say, this is a flawed team that's going to be in a dogfight against pretty much any of these teams they may match up with in the playoff if they do go 11-1?
Yeah, I mean, I think just kind of looking at the way the playoff picture is right now, obviously Penn State's kind of out of the conversation for one of those top 4 conference champion spots. And then they're also kind of out of that number 5 spot because they're not going to be ahead of Ohio State or Oregon, the loser of the Big Ten championship. And I think that, at best, if you're Penn State, you can potentially get number 6, which is, where they're at right now. Because of the conference auto bids, they would get bumped down to 7 because the winner of the Big 12 would have to jump them. But yeah, I think if you're Penn State, and you miss out on the potential of the 5-12 matchup where you would get the group of 5 champion, which would obviously be an easy win. So if you're Penn State, you're probably going to get, one of the top 3 or 4 teams in the SEC, or potentially Notre Dame, or you're going to get a good team, regardless of if you're 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever. It's going to be a tough matchup for Penn State potentially on the road. I think obviously home field advantage will play a big role if Penn State's able to get the matchup at home. And yeah, I mean, there's no really situation there where I would feel confident with Penn State going into that matchup. Whether it's whoever you have, Tennessee, Texas A&M, Notre Dame, you could throw in any team. I don't think any of the teams that are kind of in that range right now that are fighting for those spots, I don't think Penn State would feel comfortable playing any of them really. Just because, again, of you have to look at Penn State's struggles in these big games. You have to look at James Franklin's struggles in these big games, and you have to kind of worry there. I do kind of like that they've had a couple of these comebacks this season, kind of some of these exciting wins. I look at USC in particular, that was a great win over a talented team. And that's something that I think gives you a little bit of hope that, Penn State's able to kind of punch back, which I think is the biggest thing, because we all know Penn State can beat, a Rutgers. Penn State can beat a Northwestern when it's just a blowout. But, we don't see a lot of these back and forth battles, because typically it's, lose to Ohio State, lose to Michigan, beat everyone else comfortably. We don't see them in a lot of these back and forth battles, which is why I think that win over USC is kind of key, because we were able to see them kind of face some adversity, take a hit, get back up, get back in the fight, and end up winning and pulling it off. So, I wouldn't count Penn State out. That's not to say that, I think they will lose, but I also don't think, any possible opponent at this point from where Penn State is, they're not going to get an easy first round opponent. So.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Joel, I could keep going for a while. There's so much to talk about now that they've lost a game. The first loss kind of always animates the conversation, and fortunately, we have many more weeks after this to kind of break things down. and talk about the state of the program mixed with, the day-to-day and the week-to-week of this team. So if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. We always appreciate that. We're here every Wednesday afternoon. If you enjoyed this video, please like it. Help us out in the YouTube algorithm. Really helps on the Penn State front because, again, this is a Steelers-heavy channel. So any algorithmic support we can get for Penn State content is always appreciated. Joel, I will look forward to talking to you again next week. Enjoy the whiteout. And everyone else, we'll talk again soon.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.